The underestimated species, the Zeta Prime military complex, stretched across 3 moons, a testament to the Galactic Defense Alliance's power and technological supremacy. Its gleaming towers pierced the artificial atmosphere, housing the galaxy's most elite military training facilities. Here, the finest warriors from 47 different species honed their skills, preparing for conflicts that could determine the fate of entire star systems. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at the observation deck of Transport Bay 7, watching as another group of alien cadets disembarked from their sleek vessels. Towering Zolonians with their crystalline skin and natural armor plating. Swift Kitherans with their 6 arms and lightning reflexes. Massive Vorthax whose hide could deflect energy weapons. Each species represented millions of years of evolution perfected for combat. Then there were the humans. Sarah adjusted her standard-issue uniform, the fabric feeling thin and inadequate compared to the natural protection her alien counterparts possessed. At 32, she carried herself with the disciplined bearing of someone who had spent 14 years in Earth's combined marine forces. Her service record included 3 combat deployments, 2 distinguished service medals, and commendations for tactical excellence that meant nothing here among the stars. The Transport Bay's automated announcement system crackled to life, its translation matrix converting the message into dozens of languages simultaneously. Attention, all personnel. General Kreck's Vanguard will address new trainees in Assembly Hall Delta at 1,400 hours. Attendance is mandatory for all species classifications. Sarah grimaced. General Krex had made his opinions about human participation in the Alliance military abundantly clear during her first week at Zeta Prime. The ancient Zolonian warrior stood nearly 9 feet tall, his crystalline exoskeleton bearing the scars of countless battles. His service record spanned over 2 centuries, including leadership roles in the Andorian conflict and the suppression of the rebel colony's uprising. He also considered humans to be the galaxy's biggest mistake. As Sarah made her way through the complex's corridors, she passed groups of alien cadets engaged in casual conversation. The automatic translation systems captured fragments of their discussions, most of which centered around the upcoming war games and speculation about assignment to elite units. None of the conversations included humans. The isolation wasn't accidental. When Earth had been granted provisional membership in the Galactic Defense Alliance 5 years ago, it had been with significant restrictions. Humans were classified as support personnel only with strictly limited access to advanced weapons training and combat roles. The official reasoning cited humanity's lack of natural armor, inferior physical capabilities, and limited sensory abilities compared to established Alliance species. Sarah had read the classification reports. According to Alliance xenobiologists, humans possessed adequate cognitive function for technical support roles, but lacked the physiological requirements for frontline combat service. The assessment noted that while humans had successfully engaged in warfare on their homeworld, this was attributed to their species' tendency towards self-destruction rather than any meaningful martial capability. What the reports didn't mention was Sarah's service record on Earth, her deployments to the Antarctic Rebellion, where she had led a squad through 3 months of guerrilla warfare in sub-zero conditions. Her role in the Singapore defense, where she had held a strategic position against overwhelming odds for 18 hours until reinforcements arrived. Her certification in 17 different combat disciplines, and her instructor rating in close-quarters combat. None of that mattered here. Here, she was just another weak human taking up space that could be better used by a real warrior. The Assembly Hall Delta could accommodate 5,000 beings, its tiered design allowing for the various physiological needs of different species. Atmospheric zones provided appropriate breathing mixtures, while gravity fields could be adjusted for species requiring different environmental conditions. It was an impressive display of technology that reminded everyone present of the Alliance's advanced capabilities. General Krex took the central podium with the commanding presence that had made him a legend throughout the galaxy. His crystalline skin reflected the hall's lighting in patterns that created an almost hypnotic effect, while his 4 arms moved with practiced military precision. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Warriors of the Alliance," he began, his words translated instantly for the assembled crowd. "You have been selected to train at Zeta Prime because you represent the finest combat potential your species can offer. Here, you will be forged into instruments of galactic peace, prepared to face any threat that may arise." His gaze swept across the assembled cadets, lingering briefly on the small section where humans sat. "However, not all who train here will achieve the same level of excellence. The Alliance, in its wisdom and compassion, has extended training opportunities to species of varying capabilities. While some of you will join elite combat units, others will find their calling in supporting roles essential to our overall mission." The message was clear, even if it wasn't stated directly. Sarah felt the weight of stares from alien cadets around her, some curious, others dismissive. A few Vorthak cadets in the section beside her made sounds that their translator units rendered as barely concealed laughter. "Strength comes in many forms," General Krex continued, though his tone suggested he believed some forms were significantly more valuable than others. "Natural armor, enhanced reflexes, superior sensory capabilities, and battle-tested evolution all contribute to a warrior's effectiveness. The Alliance has spent millennia identifying and cultivating these traits among our member species." He activated a holographic display showing various Alliance species in combat scenarios. Zolonians shrugging off energy weapon impacts. Kitharans moving with impossible speed to overwhelm opponents. Vorthaks using their massive strength to tear through enemy positions. Each demonstration drew approving sounds from the respective species' cadets. However, the general's voice took on a more pointed tone. "We must also acknowledge the reality of biological limitations. Some species, regardless of their enthusiasm or determination, simply lack the physiological foundation necessary for elite combat roles. This is not a judgment of worth, merely an acknowledgement of natural law." Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily. She had heard variations of this speech before, each time feeling the familiar burn of frustration at being dismissed before anyone had bothered to assess her actual capabilities. Around her, the other human cadets maintained carefully neutral expressions, though she could sense their shared anger and humiliation. "In the coming weeks," General Krex announced, "you will participate in various training exercises designed to identify your strengths and assign you to appropriate roles within the Alliance military structure. These assessments are comprehensive and fair, taking into account the unique capabilities of each species." What he didn't mention was that the assessments were designed around the capabilities of established Alliance species. Tests that favored natural armor over tactical thinking. Evaluations that measured raw strength over strategic planning. Scenarios that rewarded species-specific advantages while ignoring alternative approaches to problem-solving. After the assembly, Sarah walked with her fellow human cadets toward their assigned quarters. The group was small, only 12 humans total in a facility housing thousands of alien trainees. They had been assigned living spaces in a section of the complex originally designed for civilian contractors, separate from the warrior barracks where other species resided. "Same speech, different day," muttered Lieutenant Jake Rodriguez, formerly of Earth Space Defense Force. "I'm starting to think they brought us here just to have someone to look down on." "The general seems particularly fond of making his point," added Sergeant Lisa Chun, whose special operations background on Earth rivaled Sarah's own. I counted 6 separate references to biological limitations in that speech. Sarah remained quiet as they walked, her mind processing the general's words and the reactions of the alien cadets. She had noticed something that the others might have missed. Among the alien species, there were hierarchies even within the Alliance structure. The younger Vorthaks deferred to senior Zolonians. Kytherian cadets rarely challenged Zolonian instructors directly. Even among the galaxy's superior warrior species, some were more superior than others. What bothered her most wasn't the discrimination itself, but the casual certainty with which it was delivered. General Krex and others like him had decided that humans were inferior without ever bothering to test that assumption. They had created a system that reinforced their preconceptions while preventing any opportunity for those preconceptions to be challenged. Their quarters were functional but sparse, with basic amenities and none of the status markers that decorated the warrior barracks. Through the small window, Sarah could see the training fields where alien cadets were already engaging in combat exercises. Massive vorthacks grappled with each other while Kitharans practiced high-speed maneuvers around obstacle courses designed for their enhanced agility. "You know what really gets me?" Jake said, settling into one of the standard-issue chairs. "They keep talking about natural evolution and combat adaptation, but they've never seen humans actually fight. Not really fight." Lisa nodded in agreement. The war simulation data they have from Earth is decades old, and it doesn't account for modern human military doctrine. They're making decisions based on assumptions. Sarah finally spoke, her voice carrying the calm certainty that had served her well in combat situations on Earth. Assumptions can be dangerous things, especially when you base your entire strategy on them. The next morning brought their first official training evaluation. Sarah and her fellow humans were escorted to Training Ground Beta, a sprawling complex designed to test various combat capabilities. Alien cadets were already engaged in exercises tailored to their species' abilities, with instructors making notes on performance metrics and combat readiness. The human evaluation was scheduled for a section of the training ground that seemed almost deliberately inferior. Older equipment, basic obstacle courses, and training scenarios that felt like afterthoughts compared to the elaborate setups being used by other species. The message was clear. This was a formality, not a serious assessment. Instructor Vex, a mid-level Kytherian with the kind of bored expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, briefed them on the evaluation process. Standard physical assessment, basic weapons handling, simple tactical scenarios. Nothing too challenging. The results will help determine your support role assignments. Sarah listened carefully to the evaluation parameters, noting that they were indeed designed to highlight human weaknesses rather than identify potential strengths. The physical assessments emphasized raw strength and natural armor resistance. The weapons handling focused on systems that required sensory capabilities humans didn't possess. The tactical scenarios were structured around approaches that favored other species' natural advantages. IT was a setup designed to confirm predetermined conclusions. As the evaluation began, Sarah watched her fellow humans struggle with tests that seemed almost deliberately unfair. Jake, despite his extensive experience with energy weapons on Earth, couldn't achieve adequate scores on systems that required Kytherian-level hand-eye coordination. Lisa, whose strategic mind had earned her commendations in human conflicts, was penalized in scenarios that assumed Vorthack-level physical durability. When Sarah's turn came, she approached each challenge with the methodical precision that had served her throughout her military career. She couldn't match a Vorthack strength, so she focused on technique and leverage. She couldn't achieve Kytherian reaction speeds, so she emphasized accuracy and tactical positioning. She couldn't rely on natural armor, so she demonstrated mobility and adaptability. Her performance was adequate by the evaluation standards, but Sarah knew it didn't reflect her actual capabilities. None of the tests had allowed her to demonstrate the skills that had made her successful on Earth. Improvisational thinking, psychological warfare, the ability to turn disadvantages into tactical advantages. As the day concluded, Instructor Vex collected the evaluation data with the mechanical efficiency of someone going through motions. Results will be processed and assignments distributed within 48 hours. Most of you will likely be assigned to technical support, logistics, or medical assistance roles. Congratulations on completing your assessment. That evening, Sarah stood again at the observation deck, watching alien cadets engage in advanced combat training. They moved with impressive skill and natural ability, their evolutionary advantages on full display. But she also noticed something else: predictability. Each species fought according to well-established patterns based on their physical capabilities. Strength-based approaches from Vorthacks, speed-focused tactics from Kitharans, defensive strategies from Zolonians. What would happen, she wondered, if they encountered an opponent who didn't follow the established patterns? Someone who fought in ways their evolutionary advantages hadn't prepared them for. The question would prove more relevant than she could have imagined. 3 days after the evaluations, General Krex made an announcement that would change everything. Standing before the assembled cadets in Assembly Hall Delta, he declared his intention to conduct a special demonstration that would illustrate the practical applications of species-appropriate role assignments. The demonstration would be public, mandatory, and would feature examples of how different species should be utilized within Alliance military structure. It would include practical combat scenarios designed to highlight the natural order of things. Sarah had a feeling she knew exactly who would be chosen to demonstrate humanity's appropriate role in that natural order. She also suspected that General Krex was about to learn something about assumptions that the Alliance xenobiologists had somehow missed in their comprehensive assessments of human capabilities. The universe, as it turned out, still had a few surprises in store for those arrogant enough to think they had everything figured out. The breaking point, the central combat arena at Zeta Prime, had been constructed to showcase the finest military demonstrations in the galaxy. Its massive dome could simulate any environment, from the ice fields of Arcturus Prime to the volcanic plains of Vulcan 7. Today, however, the arena displayed its default configuration: a simple, sterile combat floor surrounded by tiered seating that could accommodate thousands of spectators. Word of General Krex's special demonstration had spread throughout the complex like wildfire. Cadets from every species had gathered to witness what promised to be an educational display of proper military hierarchy. The arena buzzed with conversations in dozens of languages, all filtered through the universal translation matrix into a cacophony of anticipation and speculation. Sarah Mitchell sat in the designated human section, her fellow cadets arranged around her in a small cluster that seemed insignificant compared to the massive alien delegations filling the arena. She had spent the previous night preparing mentally for what she knew was coming. The general's announcement had been carefully worded, but the intent was unmistakable. He planned to use humans as an example of why some species belonged in supporting roles rather than combat positions. The irony wasn't lost on her. During her years with Earth's Marine Forces, Sarah had specialized in exactly the kind of close-quarters combat that the Alliance seemed to dismiss as irrelevant. Her training in hand-to-hand combat, improvised weapons, and psychological warfare had been developed specifically for situations where technological superiority wasn't available. Skills that proved invaluable when facing opponents who believed they held every advantage. General Krex entered the arena with the ceremonial pomp that befitted his status. His crystalline exoskeleton had been polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the arena's lights in patterns that created an almost hypnotic display. Behind him walked a procession of senior instructors from various species, each carrying themselves with the confidence of beings accustomed to military dominance. The general's voice boomed across the arena without need for amplification, his words immediately translated for the diverse audience. Warriors and future defenders of the Alliance, today we address a fundamental principle that governs effective military organization: the proper utilization of available resources based on natural capabilities. He gestured toward a holographic display that materialized above the arena floor, showing statistical comparisons between different Alliance species. Physical strength measurements, reaction time averages, sensory capability ranges, and natural armor effectiveness ratings scrolled past in neat, orderly columns that painted a clear picture of hierarchical superiority. These measurements, General Krex continued, represent millions of years of evolutionary development. Each species has been forged by their homeworld's challenges, developing specific advantages that make them valuable members of our Alliance. Understanding these advantages allows us to deploy our forces most effectively. The display shifted to show tactical scenarios where different species excelled. Vorthax breaching heavily fortified positions through sheer strength. Kithrans conducting reconnaissance missions using their superior speed and agility. Zolonians holding defensive lines with their natural armor, absorbing enemy fire that would devastate lesser species. However, the general's tone shifted to carry a note of regretful necessity. We must also acknowledge limitations. Not every species can excel in every role, regardless of their determination or training. Attempting to force unsuitable assignments compromises mission effectiveness and endangers lives. Sarah felt the weight of stares from around the arena as the general's meaning became increasingly obvious. The holographic display now showed human physical statistics, numbers that looked pathetically small compared to the other species' capabilities. Murmurs of amusement rippled through sections dominated by alien cadets. To illustrate this principle, General Krex announced, "We will conduct practical demonstrations showing both appropriate and inappropriate role assignments." These examples will help clarify why the Alliance has developed its current personnel classification system. The arena floor reconfigured itself, creating a series of combat scenarios. Designed to test different types of capabilities, obstacle courses that required massive strength to navigate, weapons systems calibrated for alien sensory abilities, tactical simulations that assumed physiological advantages humans simply didn't possess. Our first demonstration, the General declared, will feature volunteers from our human trainees, attempting scenarios designed for primary combat species. This will illustrate why proper role assignment is crucial for mission success. Sarah wasn't surprised when her name was called first. She had expected this moment since the General's announcement, and she had spent considerable time deciding how to respond. She could refuse, claiming the demonstration was unfair or inappropriate. She could participate half-heartedly, accepting the predetermined failure as inevitable. Or she could treat this as what it actually was, an opportunity. Rising from her seat with military precision, Sarah made her way to the arena floor while thousands of alien eyes tracked her movement. The General watched her approach with the satisfied expression of someone about to prove a long-held point. Around the arena, she could hear the quiet conversations and occasional laughter that suggested most spectators viewed this as entertainment rather than education. The first scenario involved a weapon system designed for Kytherian physiology. The targeting interface required simultaneous input from 6 different appendages while processing visual information across a spectrum that human eyes couldn't detect. It was quite literally impossible for a human to operate effectively. Sarah approached the system methodically, studying its configuration and interface design. Instead of attempting to use it as intended, she began examining alternative approaches. Could the targeting system be recalibrated? Were there manual overrides that bypassed the multi-appendage requirements? How might someone adapt this technology for use by a species with different physiological capabilities? Within minutes, she had identified several potential modifications that would make the system accessible to human operators while maintaining its tactical effectiveness. She demonstrated these adaptations to the assembled crowd, explaining her reasoning through the arena's communication system. Interesting, General Krex commented, though his tone suggested he found it anything but. However, battlefield conditions rarely allow for equipment modification. Combat effectiveness requires the ability to use systems as designed, not the luxury of adaptation time. The second scenario was more direct, a physical obstacle course designed for Vortex strength levels. Barriers that required massive force to move, gaps that could only be crossed with superhuman jumping ability, and resistance challenges calibrated for species with natural armor plating. This time, Sarah didn't attempt to adapt the scenario to her capabilities. Instead, she demonstrated alternative approaches that achieved the same tactical objectives through different means. Where Vortex would smash through barriers, she found ways around them. Where they would leap across gaps, she identified climbing routes that required technique rather than raw jumping power. Where they would power through resistance challenges, she used leverage and momentum to achieve similar results. Her performance wasn't faster than a Vortex would have been, but it was effective. More importantly, it illustrated something that the scenario designers had apparently not considered. There was usually more than one way to accomplish any given objective. The alien audience's reaction was mixed. Some species appeared genuinely interested in the alternative approaches Sarah demonstrated. Others seemed confused by tactics that didn't rely on overwhelming force or natural advantages. A few sections of the crowd had grown noticeably quieter, perhaps recognizing implications they hadn't previously considered. General Krex, however, was clearly frustrated by Sarah's performance. She had refused to fail in the spectacular fashion he had obviously expected, instead turning his demonstration into something resembling actual tactical education. His crystalline features had taken on a darker hue that suggested rising anger. Clever adaptations, he said, his voice carrying across the arena with forced calm. However, real combat doesn't offer the luxury of studied examination and careful planning. Warriors must react instantly to threats, relying on trained instincts and natural capabilities. Speed and decisiveness often determine survival. The general stepped onto the arena floor himself, his massive form dwarfing Sarah's human frame. The final demonstration will involve direct combat simulation, a scenario where adaptation and cleverness must give way to fundamental physiological reality. Sarah felt a chill of recognition as she realized what was happening. This wasn't a training, exercise, or educational demonstration anymore. General Krex was creating a situation where he could personally humiliate her in front of the entire Alliance Training Command, using his overwhelming physical advantages to prove his point about human inadequacy. The arena's holographic systems activated, creating a simulated battlefield environment around them. Obstacles provided cover and tactical positions, while environmental hazards added complexity to the scenario. The objective was simple: a direct confrontation between two opponents, with victory determined by whoever could neutralize the other first. What made the scenario particularly unfair was the weapon selection. Sarah was given a standard Alliance training weapon calibrated for human physiology, while General Krex carried the ceremonial combat staff he had wielded during his legendary military campaigns. The staff was both a technological marvel and a work of art, incorporating energy projection systems and kinetic amplifiers that made it devastatingly effective in the hands of a skilled Zolonian warrior. "Begin," the general commanded, and the simulation activated. Krex moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his centuries of combat experience evident in every step. The staff in his hands became an extension of his will, energy discharges and kinetic strikes creating a web of destruction that forced Sarah to constantly retreat and seek cover. For the first several minutes, the demonstration proceeded exactly as the general had intended. Sarah found herself consistently outmaneuvered by an opponent whose natural advantages and superior weaponry made direct confrontation impossible. She was forced to rely on hit-and-run tactics, desperately trying to find any opportunity to score meaningful hits while avoiding the general's overwhelming offensive capabilities. The alien audience watched with growing satisfaction as their expectations were confirmed. This was the natural order asserting itself, proof that some species simply weren't meant for primary combat roles regardless of their determination or creativity, but Sarah was learning. Each exchange taught her something about the general's fighting style, his preferences, his assumptions about how combat should proceed. More importantly, she was beginning to recognize patterns in his behavior that suggested something crucial. General Krex had spent centuries fighting opponents who shared his basic assumptions about warfare. He expected enemies to meet strength with strength, to respond to aggression with counteraggression, to fight according to established patterns that his experience had taught him to counter. What he hadn't prepared for was an opponent who refused to fight the way he expected. Sarah's tactics began to shift from desperate defense to calculated harassment. Instead of trying to match the general's firepower, she focused on disrupting his positioning. Rather than engaging his strengths directly, she attacked the assumptions underlying his fighting style. She used the environment in ways he hadn't anticipated, created tactical situations he wasn't prepared for, and gradually forced him to fight her battle instead of his own. The change in momentum was subtle at first, noticeable only to the most experienced military observers in the audience. General Krex found himself responding to Sarah's initiatives rather than imposing his own tactical preferences. His attacks, while still devastating when they connected, were increasingly directed at positions she had already abandoned. His defensive positions were being compromised by angles of attack he hadn't considered. Growing frustration became evident in the general's movements. His strikes became more aggressive, but less precise. His positioning became more aggressive, but less tactically sound. He was allowing anger to influence his decision-making, a mistake that Sarah's Earth military training had taught her to exploit ruthlessly. The turning point came when General Krex, clearly tired of what he considered an inferior opponent's refusal to accept defeat, abandoned the pretense of a training simulation entirely. Instead of continuing with the weapons-based combat scenario, he deactivated his staff and advanced on Sarah with the obvious intention of ending the demonstration through direct physical confrontation. "Enough games," he declared, his voice echoing through the arena. "Let us settle this the way warriors have settled disputes for millennia." The move was both tactically unsound and politically dangerous. By abandoning the simulation parameters, the general was essentially declaring that this was no longer a training exercise, but a personal conflict. More importantly, he was moving the confrontation into an area where his assumptions about human capabilities might prove less reliable than he expected. Sarah dropped her training weapon as well, recognizing that the general had just made a critical error. In his frustration and anger, he had abandoned the very advantages that made him superior and chosen to engage on terms that favored a completely different kind of warfare. That hand-to-hand combat between species with different physiologies wasn't about raw strength or natural armor. It was about understanding leverage, timing, and the exploitation of an opponent's expectations. It was about using an enemy's advantages against them, turning their confidence into overconfidence and their strengths into vulnerabilities. As General Krex approached, Sarah could see the certainty in his movements. He expected this to be over quickly, a simple demonstration of physical superiority that would finally prove his point about human inadequacy. His posture radiated the confidence of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility of defeat. That confidence was about to become a very expensive mistake. The general reached for her with casual contempt, intending to simply grab and restrain her in a display of overwhelming physical dominance. The movement was lazy, arrogant, and based on the assumption that a human couldn't possibly pose any meaningful threat to a Zolonian warrior of his stature. Sarah had been waiting for exactly this moment of overconfidence. What happened next would be analyzed and debated in Alliance military academies for generations to come, but to the thousands of spectators in the arena, it appeared almost too fast to follow. One moment, General Krex was reaching for what he considered an easy victory. The next, he was on his knees, his left arm bent at an angle that crystalline physiology had never intended, while a human cadet stood behind him maintaining a restraint hold that had reduced one of the Alliance's most legendary warriors to helpless immobility. The arena fell into absolute silence, broken only by the general's ragged breathing and the quiet hum of the facility's life support systems. No one seemed capable of processing what they had just witnessed. Sarah maintained the hold for exactly 10 seconds, long enough to ensure that every observer understood what had happened, then released the general and stepped back with military precision. General Krex remained kneeling for several moments, cradling his injured arm while staring at the human who had just redefined everything the Alliance thought it knew about interspecies combat capabilities. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its earlier arrogance. "How?" was all he managed to say. That Sarah's response was delivered in the same calm, professional tone she had maintained throughout the entire demonstration. "You assumed that superior physical capabilities automatically translate to superior combat effectiveness. That assumption created predictable patterns in your behavior, which could be exploited by someone trained to recognize and counter them." She gestured toward the stunned alien audience. Every species in the Alliance has developed combat techniques based on their natural advantages. Those techniques are effective against opponents who share similar physiological foundations, but they weren't designed to counter approaches that don't follow the same rules. The implications of her words rippled through the arena like shockwaves. If humans could neutralize Zolonian warriors through unconventional tactics, what other assumptions about Alliance military hierarchy might be equally flawed? How many other inferior species might possess capabilities that the current classification system had failed to recognize? General Krex struggled to his feet, his injured arm hanging uselessly at his side. The medical teams were already rushing onto the arena floor, but the real damage had been done to something more fundamental than his crystalline physiology. Everything the Alliance military establishment thought it knew about human capabilities had just been proven wrong in the most public way possible. And Sarah Mitchell, the human cadet, who had been brought here to demonstrate the importance of knowing one's place, had instead demonstrated that sometimes the most dangerous assumption is believing you understand your opponent's limitations better than they do. The Awakening the Emergency Medical Bay at Zeta Prime had treated injuries from hundreds of different species over the years, but the sight of General Krex Vanguard lying on a treatment table while medics worked to repair his shattered arm created an atmosphere of surreal disbelief. The General's crystalline physiology, which had withstood energy weapons and explosive impacts during decades of warfare, had been compromised by the bare hands of a human cadet, Dr. Yevek, the facility's chief medical officer, studied the scans with the fascination of someone encountering something entirely unprecedented. The damage pattern is unlike anything in our combat injury database, she reported to the assembled Alliance officials. The fractures suggest precise application of force at specific structural weak points that most species wouldn't even recognize, let alone know how to exploit. Admiral Thos, the Vorthack commander of Zeta Prime, stood beside the medical table with an expression that managed to convey both concern for his injured colleague and profound confusion about the circumstances that had caused the injury. At over 10 feet tall, with natural armor plating that could deflect Starship-grade weapons, the Admiral represented the pinnacle of what the Alliance considered military perfection. The idea that a human had neutralized a Zolonian general through physical combat challenged every assumption he had about galactic military hierarchy. General Krex, the Admiral said carefully, "Can you explain exactly what happened during the demonstration?" Krex winced as the medical scanners continued their work, his pride clearly suffering more damage than his arm. "I underestimated the human's capabilities," he admitted with obvious reluctance. "I assumed that superior physical strength would automatically translate to combat dominance. That assumption proved incorrect." The word incorrect seemed inadequate to describe what every witness had observed, but it represented a significant admission from a warrior who had spent centuries believing in the natural superiority of his species. Around the medical bay, other Alliance officials exchanged glances that suggested similar recalculations were taking place in their own understanding of interspecies combat dynamics. The human cadet used techniques that our combat databases don't recognize, added Colonel Vex, the Kytherian officer who had been analyzing security footage of the incident. Her movements followed no established martial doctrine from any known Alliance species. It's as if she was fighting according to completely different principles. What none of the officials mentioned, but all were beginning to realize, was that their comprehensive knowledge of galactic warfare might not be as comprehensive as they had believed. The Alliance military had spent millennia cataloging the combat capabilities of hundreds of species, developing tactical doctrines that accounted for every known advantage and weakness. The possibility that an entire approach to warfare had somehow escaped their notice was both humbling and terrifying. In a conference room 3 levels above the medical bay, an emergency session of the Alliance Training Command was struggling to address the implications of what had occurred. Representatives from 12 different species sat around a curved table designed to accommodate various physiologies, their conversations filtered through translation matrices that couldn't quite capture the nuances of confusion and concern in their voices. "The incident raises serious questions about our current classification protocols," stated Counselor Nex, a Zolonian administrator whose own crystalline features seemed somewhat dimmer than usual. "If human combat capabilities have been fundamentally misunderstood, we need to reassess not just their role assignments, but our entire approach to species evaluation." Commander Urel of the Kytherian delegation activated a holographic display showing comparative statistics between humans and other Alliance species. The data clearly shows humans as inferior in every measurable physical category: strength, speed, sensory capability, natural armor. They rank in the bottom percentile across all metrics. How does this reconcile with what we witnessed? The question hung in the air like an accusation, challenging not just the specific assessments of human capabilities, but the entire methodology the Alliance used to evaluate military potential. If their comprehensive testing had missed something this significant about humans, what else might they have overlooked about other species? Perhaps, suggested Dr. Kelvin, the human diplomatic liaison who had been hastily summoned from Earth, the issue isn't with your data collection, but with your assumptions about what the data means. Dr. Kelvin was a slight man in his 60s whose unimpressive physical appearance perfectly embodied everything the Alliance believed about human limitations. His presence at the emergency session was largely ceremonial, an acknowledgement of diplomatic protocol rather than a recognition of meaningful contribution to military planning. That was about to change. Human military doctrine, Dr. Kelvin continued, has always been based on the assumption that we would face opponents with superior physical capabilities. Our entire approach to warfare developed around the need to overcome disadvantages rather than leverage advantages we didn't possess. He activated his own holographic display, showing historical footage from human conflicts on Earth. What you're seeing as inferior capabilities, we learned to view as tactical constraints that required innovative solutions. When you can't outfight your enemy directly, you learn to outthink them. The footage showed human military tactics that the Alliance representatives had never seriously studied, urban warfare techniques that turned environmental limitations into advantages, guerrilla strategies that made superior numbers irrelevant, psychological operations that used enemy strengths as vulnerabilities, combat approaches that achieved victory through methods that traditional Alliance doctrine didn't recognize as warfare. The cadet who defeated General Krex wasn't using superior physical capabilities, Dr. Kelvin explained. She was using tactical principles specifically designed to neutralize opponents who possessed those capabilities. It's a completely different approach to combat than what Alliance species developed. Admiral Foss leaned forward in his specially reinforced chair, his massive frame casting shadows across the conference table. Are you suggesting that humans have been deliberately concealing their combat potential? Not concealing, Dr. Kelvin replied carefully, but you never asked the right questions. Your evaluation protocols tested for capabilities that humans don't possess while ignoring the capabilities we do possess. It's like testing fish for their ability to climb trees while ignoring their ability to swim. The implications were staggering. If humans had been systematically underestimated, the Alliance's entire military structure might need fundamental reorganization. More importantly, if the evaluation protocols had failed so dramatically with humans, how many other species might be incorrectly classified based on incomplete understanding of their actual capabilities? Meanwhile, in the human quarters of Zeta Prime, Sarah Mitchell found herself at the center of a very different kind of attention than she had experienced since arriving at the facility. Instead of dismissive glances and condescending comments, she was receiving visits from alien cadets who wanted to understand what they had witnessed in the arena. The first visitors were a group of Kytherian cadets whose natural speed and agility had always made them confident in their combat superiority. Their leader, a young warrior named Zex, approached with the careful respect usually reserved for proven veterans. Captain Mitchell, Zex said, using Sarah's Earth military rank for the first time since her arrival, we would like to understand the techniques you demonstrated against General Krex. Our combat instructors say that such movements should be impossible for human physiology. Sarah studied the group of alien cadets, recognizing the shift in their attitude, but also understanding the opportunity it represented. They're not impossible, she explained. They're just based on different principles than what you've been taught. Your species developed combat techniques that maximize your natural advantages. Humans developed techniques that compensate for our natural disadvantages. She demonstrated a basic defensive movement, the same type of technique she had used against the general. When you're smaller and weaker than your opponent, direct confrontation is suicide. But if you understand leverage and timing, you can use their strength against them. The Kytherians watched with fascination as Sarah broke down the mechanical principles underlying human combat doctrine. Concepts like redirecting force, exploiting momentum, and targeting structural weak points were completely foreign to species that had always relied on overwhelming their opponents through superior capabilities. "This is not how warriors fight," protested one of the younger Kytherians. "Combat is about dominance through strength and skill." "Combat is about achieving your objectives," Sarah corrected. "Strength and skill are just tools. If you don't have those tools, you find others." Word of these informal training sessions spread throughout the facility, and soon Sarah found herself teaching alien cadets techniques that their own instructors had never considered. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come to Zeta Prime expecting to learn from superior alien military doctrine, only to discover that human approaches to warfare offered insights that the Alliance had never developed. The real breakthrough came when Admiral Foss personally requested a demonstration of human tactical principles. The massive Vorthack commander had spent considerable time reviewing footage of Sarah's confrontation with General Krex, trying to understand how established combat doctrine could be so dramatically subverted. "Show me," he requested, simply standing in the center of a private training room. "Demonstrate how human techniques could be effective against Vorthack combat capabilities." It was a significant moment. Admiral Foss wasn't just asking for a technical explanation, he was volunteering to serve as a test subject for techniques that had already proven capable of injuring Alliance officers. The request represented a level of intellectual honesty and professional curiosity that Sarah hadn't expected from the Alliance command structure. The demonstration that followed was more careful and controlled than Sarah's confrontation with General Krex, but equally illuminating. Admiral Foss's natural armor and massive strength made him virtually invulnerable to direct attack, but human combat doctrine had never relied on direct attack. Instead, Sarah showed him how his very advantages could become limitations when an opponent refused to engage on his terms. "Your armor protects you from energy weapons and kinetic impacts," she explained while demonstrating movement patterns around his defensive positions, "but it also adds mass that affects your mobility. Your strength lets you power through obstacles, but it also creates predictable movement patterns that can be anticipated and countered." By the end of the session, Admiral Foss was beginning to understand why Alliance tactical doctrine had proven insufficient against human approaches. "We have been preparing to fight enemies who think like us," he admitted. "We never considered what would happen if we faced enemies who think differently." The revelation triggered a comprehensive review of Alliance military doctrine that would take months to complete, but the immediate consequences were already becoming apparent throughout Zeta Prime. Human cadets were being reassigned from support roles to combat training programs. Alien instructors were requesting briefings on human tactical principles. The entire facility was beginning to recognize that their understanding of interspecies warfare had been fundamentally incomplete. General Krex, his arm now properly treated but his ego still recovering, made a request that surprised everyone. He wanted to study human combat doctrine formally. "I have spent 2 centuries believing I understood warfare," he told Admiral Foss. "Today, I learned that I understood only one approach to warfare. If the Alliance is to maintain its military effectiveness, we cannot afford such ignorance." The General's request was approved, making him the first senior Alliance officer to formally study human military techniques. His initial reports would eventually lead to the establishment of entire new tactical disciplines within Alliance training programs, but the more immediate impact was symbolic. If General Krex could acknowledge the value of human approaches to warfare, it gave permission for other Alliance officers to reconsider their own assumptions to doctor. Kelvin found himself suddenly elevated from ceremonial diplomatic observer to essential military consultant. His expertise in human warfare doctrine, previously considered irrelevant to Alliance operations, was now recognized as crucial for understanding capabilities that could no longer be ignored. "The fundamental error," he explained to yet another emergency session of Alliance officials, was assuming that military effectiveness could be measured purely through physical capabilities. Human military doctrine developed around the principle that victory belongs to whoever can impose their preferred type of warfare on the engagement, not necessarily to whoever has superior physical attributes. The concept was revolutionary for species that had spent millennia equating combat effectiveness with biological advantages. The idea that tactical thinking could overcome physical limitations challenged the very foundation of Alliance military hierarchy. 6 months after the incident in the arena, Sarah Mitchell stood before a new group of cadets in what had been renamed the Integrated Combat Training Center. The facility still trained alien warriors in techniques suited to their species' capabilities, but it now also taught them to recognize and counter approaches that fell outside traditional Alliance doctrine. Combat effectiveness, she told the mixed group of human and alien cadets, isn't about having the best physical capabilities. It's about understanding how to use whatever capabilities you have most effectively while preventing your opponent from doing the same. The students before her included species that had previously never been considered for primary combat roles. Jalarian technicians whose analytical minds proved excellent at tactical planning. Nexian diplomats whose understanding of psychology translated surprisingly well to battlefield manipulation. Even Etherian philosophers whose abstract thinking generated unconventional solutions to military problems. The Alliance was discovering that military potential existed in forms they had never recognized among species they had dismissed, using approaches they had never imagined. The rigid hierarchy based on physical capabilities was giving way to a more flexible understanding of what made warriors effective. General Krex, now serving as Deputy Director of Tactical Innovation, often attended these training sessions. His presence served as a constant reminder that even the most experienced warriors could learn new approaches to their profession. The general who had once embodied Alliance military tradition was now helping to revolutionize it. The greatest danger in warfare, he would tell visiting Alliance officials, is believing you understand your enemy's capabilities better than they do. Captain Mitchell taught me that lesson in a way I will never forget. The arena where Sarah had defeated the general was now used for demonstrations of integrated combat techniques, with cadets from different species learning to coordinate their various capabilities in ways that maximize collective effectiveness rather than individual dominance. The old model of species-based military hierarchy was being replaced by tactical flexibility that recognized the value of diverse approaches to warfare. Earth status within the Alliance had been formally upgraded from support personnel only to full combat integration, with human military advisors being assigned to Alliance units throughout the galaxy. The change represented more than just bureaucratic reclassification. It acknowledged that the galaxy's understanding of warfare itself had been incomplete. Sarah often reflected on the irony of her situation. She had come to Zeta Prime expecting to learn from superior alien military doctrine, only to discover that human approaches to warfare offered insights that the most advanced galactic civilization had somehow missed. The experience had taught her that assumptions about superiority and inferiority were often based on incomplete understanding rather than actual capability. The universe, as it turned out, was full of surprises for those wise enough to question their assumptions and humble enough to learn from them. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent was the one everyone underestimated, and sometimes the greatest military innovations came from species that traditional doctrine considered least qualified to provide them. In her final report to Earth Command, Sarah wrote, "The Alliance military represents thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about warfare, but that knowledge was built on the assumption that all effective combat approaches would be based on physical superiority. Human military doctrine, developed around overcoming physical disadvantages, represents an entirely different paradigm that the Alliance had never encountered. The integration of these approaches has created tactical possibilities that neither humans nor aliens had previously imagined." The report concluded with a recommendation that would shape Earth's military development for generations. The greatest advantage any species can possess is the willingness to learn from others, especially from those they initially consider inferior. The moment you believe you have nothing left to learn is the moment you become vulnerable to someone who never stopped learning. General Krex, reading the report in his new capacity as tactical advisor, added his own endorsement. Captain Mitchell's assessment is accurate. The Alliance has become stronger not by maintaining its traditional hierarchies, but by abandoning the assumptions that created those hierarchies. True military excellence requires the humility to recognize that effective warfare can take forms you never anticipated. The transformation of Alliance military doctrine would take years to fully implement. But the foundation had been established in a 4-second confrontation between a human cadet and a general who thought he understood everything about combat. Sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected teachers, and sometimes the greatest victories were won not through superior strength, but through superior understanding of what strength actually meant. The galaxy had learned that physical capabilities were just one form of military potential, and that the species they had underestimated might possess capabilities they had never thought to measure. It was a lesson that would reshape interstellar warfare and remind every military leader that assumptions about enemy limitations could prove to be the most dangerous assumptions of all.